All right, history buffs and casual scroll stoppers, listen up. We've all heard the story. The Roman Empire, mighty and eternal, simply fell. And usually, the go-to villain is some vaguely aggressive barbarian horde, right? But what if I told you that's just the tip of the iceberg? What if the real reasons for Rome's collapse were far more insidious, lurking in the shadows of power, money, and even Mother Nature? Buckle up, because we're about to expose the hidden, messy, and frankly, kinda scandalous truth behind Rome's epic downfall. Spoiler alert, it wasn't just barbarians being rude. For centuries, the fall of Rome has been simplified into this neat little package. Hordes of uncivilized invaders sacked the city, case closed. Easy peasy, right? Wrong. That narrative ignores the centuries of rot, the self-inflicted wounds, and the sheer cosmic bad luck that plagued the empire from within. We are talking about a slow, painful implosion, not a sudden explosion. Think less alien invasion movie and more a really long, drawn-out reality TV show where everyone's backstabbing each other and the plumbing keeps breaking. First up, let's talk about politics, specifically, how absolutely, undeniably rotten Roman politics became. Imagine a system where loyalty was bought, offices were sold to the highest bidder, and public service was just a stepping stone to personal enrichment. Sounds familiar? Yeah, some things never change. This wasn't just a few bad emperors. It was a systemic sickness that eroded trust, paralyzed governance, and made any effective long-term planning basically impossible. The empire was being eaten alive from the inside by its own supposed leaders. Speaking of instability, let's play Emperor Roulette. In a period of just 75 years during the 3rd century, Rome saw over 20 legitimate emperors, plus countless usurpers. That's a new boss every 3.5 years. Imagine trying to run a global empire when the guy at the top is constantly changing, often violently. Most met gruesome ends, assassinated by their own guards, rivals, or just disgruntled citizens. This constant turnover meant no consistent policies, no long-term vision, and certainly no peaceful transitions of power. It was less a government, more a blood sport. And who was often behind this Emperor Roulette? None other than the Praetorian Guard. Originally the emperor's elite bodyguards, these guys quickly realized they held the real power. They weren't just protecting emperors, they were making them, often by force. They'd assassinate an emperor, then literally auction off the throne to the highest bidder, making the entire imperial system a mockery. Imagine the Secret Service selling the presidency to whoever flashes the most cash. Rome effectively had its own private army that decided who ruled, and loyalty became a very expensive commodity. Now, let's talk money, or rather, the lack of its value. Roman emperors, facing constant wars and lavish spending, got a brilliant idea. Why not just print more money? Except they didn't print it, they debased the coinage. They'd take silver coins, melt them down, add cheaper metals like copper, and make more coins. Voila! Instant wealth. Except, not really. This led to rampant inflation, making goods ridiculously expensive and trust in the currency non-existent. People started hoarding actual silver or bartering, crippling the economy from the very bottom up. With the economy in freefall, who paid the price? The ordinary citizens, of course. Emperors needed to fund their wars, their lavish lifestyles, and their ever-expanding bureaucracy, so taxes became excruciatingly high. Farmers, the backbone of the empire, were hit hardest. They couldn't afford to pay, leading them to abandon their land, flee to large, self-sufficient estates, which only made the central government weaker, or even sell themselves into servitude. This created a vicious cycle. Fewer farmers meant less food, less tax revenue, and more economic instability. A true death by 1,000 taxes. Here's another hidden cause: Rome's heavy reliance on slave labor. While it fueled their early expansion, it became a massive weakness. Why innovate with new technologies when you have an endless supply of free human labor? This stifled creativity and technological advancement. When Rome stopped conquering and expanding, the supply of new slaves dwindled. The entire economic model, built on conquest and cheap labor, suddenly hit a wall. Without the impetus for innovation, and with a stagnating labor force, the Roman economy couldn't adapt to new challenges. Rome was a vast empire, relying heavily on complex trade routes to feed its cities and supply its armies. Think of it as the ultimate ancient supply chain. But guess what happens when your borders are constantly under threat and internal stability is a myth? Those trade routes get choked. Pirates, bandits, and rival factions disrupted the flow of essential goods like grain, olive oil, and wine. This led to shortages, inflated prices, and economic isolation for many regions. When the food stops flowing, the cities empty out and the empire starts to starve itself. All right, let's finally talk about those barbarians, but with a twist. The popular image is simple: uncivilized brutes with no real goal beyond smashing and looting. But the reality is far more nuanced, and frankly, more tragic. Many barbarian groups were not just invaders. They were often migrating peoples, pushed by their own external pressures like climate change or even other, fiercer barbarians. They often sought land, safety, and a place asterisk within asterisk the Roman system, not just its destruction. The Romans themselves often made things worse through deceit, betrayal, and underestimation. One of the biggest hidden ironies is how much Rome relied on these very barbarians to defend itself. As Roman manpower dwindled and loyalty wavered, emperors started recruiting barbarian tribes as federates, allies who were given land and paid to defend the borders. Sounds like a decent plan, right? Except these groups often retained their own identity, leaders, and military structures. It was like hiring a competing company to run your security, only for them to eventually decide they liked your building better. This integration brought internal divisions and eventually, these federates became independent kingdoms asterisk inside asterisk Roman territory. The Roman army, once the envy of the ancient world, was slowly rotting from within. It wasn't just about hiring barbarians. It was about the loyalty, or lack thereof, of the soldiers. As central authority weakened, legions increasingly swore allegiance to their generals rather than the emperor or the state. This led to devastating civil wars, where Roman fought Roman, bleeding the empire dry of resources and manpower. The army became less a tool for defense and more a political weapon, making it ineffective against external threats because it was too busy fighting itself. Rome's empire was vast, and maintaining its enormous borders was an unimaginable drain on resources. Think about the cost of building and garrisoning miles of walls like Hadrian's, or maintaining legions across 3 continents. Every single soldier, every fort, every supply line was an expense. This overextension meant money that could have been invested in infrastructure, education, or economic development was instead funneled into defense, often inefficiently. The empire was simply too big to govern, too big to defend, and too big to afford, bleeding money from its core. Yes, even climate change played a hidden role. For centuries, Rome benefited from a warm, stable climate that supported its agriculture. But around the 3rd century AD, things got chilly. Historians and scientists point to periods of colder temperatures and increased aridity. Essentially, mini ice ages and droughts. This wasn't some isolated incident. These environmental shifts caused widespread crop failures, famine, and resource scarcity across vast regions. Imagine your breadbasket suddenly becoming a dust bowl. This put immense pressure on an already struggling empire, forcing populations to move and exacerbating other issues. When the climate turned, so did Rome's fortunes. Climate-induced crop failures in critical regions meant empty granaries and widespread famine. Egypt, for example, was Rome's breadbasket, but even its fertile land suffered. Food shortages led to soaring prices, riots in the cities, and mass starvation. A hungry populace is a discontent populace, and a starving empire is a weak one. This forced an already strained administration to deal with existential crises on top of everything else, further destabilizing a system that was already teetering. You can't run an empire if you can't feed your people. And here's where climate change intersects directly with those barbarian invasions we mentioned. Environmental pressures weren't just hitting Rome, they were hitting groups further east, like the Huns and various Germanic tribes. Droughts, resource scarcity, and pressure from even more nomadic groups pushed these peoples westward, directly into Roman territory. These weren't necessarily hostile invasions from the start, but mass migrations of desperate people seeking new homes. Rome's inability to either effectively integrate or repel these climate refugees became a major destabilizing force, a domino effect set off by changing weather patterns. If economic turmoil and political chaos weren't enough, Mother Nature unleashed another hidden weapon: plagues. The Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, swept through the empire starting in 165 AD, lasting for decades. It decimated the population, killing an estimated 15 to 30% of Romans. Imagine a disease that wipes out nearly a third of your workforce, your tax base, and your army. This wasn't just a bump in the road. It was a demographic catastrophe that severely weakened the empire, reducing its ability to defend its borders, collect taxes, and maintain its infrastructure. A silent, biological killer. Centuries later, just as the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, was trying to reclaim its former glory, another, even more devastating pandemic hit: the Plague of Justinian. Starting in 541 AD, this bubonic plague ripped through the Mediterranean world, killing an estimated 25 to 50 million people, possibly half the world's population at the time. It crippled Justinian's grand plans to reunite the empire, halted economic activity, and left entire regions depopulated. Imagine society grinding to a halt, not because of an invading army, but an invisible enemy. This was a biological force that reshaped the entire late antique world. The aftermath of these plagues was catastrophic and long-lasting. Labor shortages soared, leading to skyrocketing wages in some areas and complete economic collapse in others. With fewer people, there was less tax revenue, making it harder to pay for armies, administration, and infrastructure. Cities shrank, trade withered, and vast tracts of land lay fallow. The empire became a shadow of its former self, its resilience shattered. These pandemics didn't just kill people, they killed economies, armies, and the very fabric of Roman society, setting the stage for permanent decline. Let's zoom back to internal power struggles. The Roman Senate, once the powerful bedrock of the Republic, gradually saw its authority eroded by ambitious emperors. As power became centralized in the hands of one man, the checks and balances disappeared. The Senate became a rubber stamp, its debates meaningless. This loss of an independent deliberative body meant fewer voices providing counsel, less accountability for emperors, and a decline in civic participation. Without strong institutions to keep imperial power in check, the empire became vulnerable to the whims of unstable or incompetent rulers, accelerating its internal decay. The sheer size of the empire eventually led to an identity crisis, literally. The division into Western and Eastern halves, and the rise of new capitals like Constantinople, fragmented administration and diluted the sense of a singular Rome. Resources were split, priorities diverged, and loyalty became divided. While the Eastern Empire eventually thrived as Byzantium, the Western half struggled to maintain cohesion. Imagine a company trying to operate with two separate, competing headquarters and different visions for the future. It's a recipe for disaster, and Rome got a double dose of it. It's a huge hidden clue that the Western Roman Empire fell, but the eastern part, the Byzantine Empire, survived for another 1,000 years. Why? The West faced constant barbarian pressure, had a less urbanized, poorer economy, and lacked the East's geographic advantages. The East, with its rich trade routes, centralized bureaucracy, and better defenses, was simply more resilient. This comparison highlights that Rome's collapse wasn't inevitable for the whole empire, but rather a specific failure of the western half to adapt to a compounding series of internal and external stresses. A tale of two empires, indeed. Rome was famous for its incredible infrastructure: roads, aqueducts, bridges. But as the empire declined, so did the maintenance of these vital networks. Roads fell into disrepair, making travel and trade slower and more dangerous. Aqueducts crumbled, impacting urban sanitation and water supply. This decay wasn't just inconvenient, it was economically crippling. It isolated regions, hindered military movements, and generally made the empire less connected and less efficient. It's hard to run a unified empire when your fundamental lifelines are literally falling apart, piece by piece. Speaking of infrastructure, Roman cities, once vibrant centers of commerce and culture, began to crumble. As economic conditions worsened, security became precarious, and populations moved away from urban centers. Many migrated to the countryside, seeking safety and sustenance on large, self-sufficient estates, latifundia, owned by powerful landowners. This ruralization meant less centralized control, less tax revenue, and a loss of the very urban dynamism that had defined Roman civilization. Cities became ghost towns, symbols of a fading glory, with their former residents increasingly isolated and disconnected from imperial authority. Now for a truly intriguing, albeit controversial, hidden cause: lead poisoning. The Romans used lead extensively, in their water pipes, cooking vessels, and even as a sweetener for wine. Some historians theorize that chronic lead exposure, especially among the elite, led to widespread health problems, infertility, cognitive decline, and even madness. While hard to prove conclusively, imagine a ruling class slowly being poisoned, becoming less capable, less fertile, and more irrational. It's a chilling thought that a common element could have silently eroded the very minds leading the empire. Okay, let's address the elephant in the Roman baths: moral decay. For a long time, people pointed to Roman decadence, orgies, and lavish excess as a primary reason for their downfall. And yes, some Romans definitely knew how to party. But while perceived moral decline might be a symptom of a society in trouble, it's rarely a root cause. Blaming toga parties and gluttony distracts from the deeper systemic issues: the political corruption, the economic collapse, the military failures. It's more fun to imagine debauchery, but the real story is far more complex and far less dramatic than a moral meltdown. Another subtle but significant factor was the decline in education and innovation. As the empire became more chaotic, literacy rates fell, and the focus shifted from intellectual pursuits to mere survival. The Roman spirit of practical engineering and governance began to wane. There was less incentive to innovate, less investment in new ideas, and a general intellectual stagnation. An empire that stops learning and adapting is an empire on borrowed time. This brain drain meant Rome couldn't come up with new solutions to its mounting problems, trapping it in old, failing ways. Sometimes, the most obvious hidden cause is staring you right in the face. The empire was simply too big. At its peak, it spanned 3 continents, countless cultures, and millions of people. Governing such a colossal entity was a logistical nightmare. Communication was slow, administration was cumbersome, and projecting power effectively across vast distances became impossible. This overextension made all the other problems, corruption, economic woes, military weakness, exponentially worse. The empire became a victim of its own success, expanding beyond its capacity to maintain cohesion and control. The crisis of the 3rd century was basically Rome's dress rehearsal for its final collapse. For 50 years, the empire was hammered by a perfect storm of every problem we've discussed: rampant civil wars, constant barbarian incursions, a devastating plague, and hyperinflation. It was a period of near total collapse, with emperors rising and falling at an alarming rate. That Rome even survived this period is a testament to its underlying strength. But it came out of it profoundly changed and permanently weakened, laying the groundwork for the eventual, irreversible decline of the West. Enter Emperor Diocletian, who, after the 3rd century crisis, valiantly tried to fix everything. His reforms included dividing the empire into 4 administrative regions, the Tetrarchy, to make it more governable, and implementing strict price edicts to combat inflation. These were bold, ambitious moves. And initially, they worked, stabilizing the empire for a while. But they were ultimately band-aid solutions. They didn't address the fundamental, underlying issues of economic stagnation, loyalty shifts, or the crushing external pressures. You can reshuffle the deck all you want, but if the cards are bad, the game's still rigged. The rise of Christianity is another fascinating, often debated factor. While not a direct cause of collapse, its adoption as the state religion under Constantine brought significant shifts. Traditional Roman civic religion, which emphasized loyalty to the state and emperor, was replaced by a faith that prioritized spiritual salvation over earthly empire. This arguably shifted loyalty from the civic to the divine, potentially diverting resources and enthusiasm away from maintaining the earthly state. It wasn't a destructive force, but a profound cultural and ideological transformation that changed the empire's internal dynamics. Perhaps the most intangible, yet profound, hidden cause was a psychological one: a loss of confidence, civic pride, and belief in the Roman mission. After centuries of decline, constant warfare, and economic hardship, did the Romans simply lose the will to *be*Roman? Did they lose faith in their institutions and their leaders? When people stop believing in the future of their society, when cynicism and apathy take root, it's incredibly hard to rally them to face existential threats. A spirit broken by endless crises, unable to envision a better tomorrow, is an empire already half fallen. Many historians argue that Rome didn't die from one fatal blow, but from a slow, agonizing process, a death by 1,000 cuts. This quote often summarizes the complex, multifactorial nature of the collapse. It highlights that no single event or reason was enough on its own. Instead, it was the accumulation and interaction of all these hidden causes: political corruption, economic collapse, climate change, pandemics, military decline, and internal strife, that created a fatal feedback loop, slowly but surely eroding the empire's ability to recover and adapt. A powerful, elegant summary of Rome's fate. So, here's the ultimate hidden truth: none of these factors operated in a vacuum. Political instability worsened economic woes, which in turn weakened the military, making the empire vulnerable to barbarian migrations often driven by climate change and exacerbated by pandemics. It was a giant, tangled web of cause and effect, a domino effect where each falling piece pushed another, creating an unstoppable cascade towards collapse. It wasn't a linear progression. It was a complex, interconnected system failing in multiple places simultaneously. The empire became too fragile to withstand any one crisis, let alone all of them. The biggest myth to bust is the idea that Rome fell on a specific date. You'll often hear 476 AD mentioned, when the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. But that was a symbolic moment in a process that had been going on for centuries. The empire didn't collapse overnight. It slowly transformed, decayed, and fragmented over generations. It was a gradual unraveling, a long, drawn-out decline that felt more like a slow descent than a sudden cliff dive. The Roman way of life had been changing, shrinking, and adapting long before 476 AD. So, what about 476 AD? It marks the deposition of Romulus Augustulus by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, often cited as the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But in reality, very few people at the time even noticed. Most regions were already governed by barbarian kings who nominally acknowledged Roman authority. It was more a change of who was holding the top title, rather than a sudden end to Roman life. The fall was merely the final, formal acknowledgement of a reality that had already been in place for decades, a quiet whimper, not a glorious bang. The collapse of the Roman Empire isn't just a fascinating historical footnote. It's a powerful cautionary tale for every society, including our own. It shows us that even the mightiest civilizations are vulnerable to a complex interplay of political folly, economic fragility, environmental shifts, and biological threats. It teaches us the importance of adaptable governance, equitable distribution of resources, maintaining strong social cohesion, and being prepared for the unexpected. The lessons from Rome's rubble resonate today, warning us to look beyond simplistic answers for complex problems. So, there you have it. The Roman Empire's true collapse was a deep, multifaceted saga, far removed from the simplified tales of barbarian hordes. It was a story of hidden internal struggles, the slow rot of corruption, the silent killers of plague and lead, the invisible hand of climate change, and the constant backstabbing in the halls of power. It's a testament to history's complexity and a reminder that the loudest narratives aren't always the truest. Next time someone mentions Rome's fall, you'll know there's a whole lot more to the story than meets the eye. Stay curious, history explorers.